There's been a lot of talk recently about factions in Star Citizen. Now, this is a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. Something I've always felt very strongly about in most games, not just Star Citizen. I've always planned to make a video about this, and it just so happens to coincide with CIG recently talking about them in the last ISC. But another inspiration for this video came from one of the comments on my last video. I'm going to put the comment here on the screen. You could pause the video and read it if you'd like, and I really think that you should. But this comment mostly sums up everything I feel about factions, but I do want to elaborate a bit further on them and why I think they're important. All of the most successful, or at least enjoyable games I've played, that are MMOs anyway, have had some form of factions in them. Something for a player to join and to take part of. Something separate from their own guild or organization or clan or whatever you want to call it. And I've also found that games without factions tend to all have the same problem. And that problem is a group of players forming their own player faction, we'll call it that, and typically monopolizing and dominating something on a server. My first experience with this was way back in the day when I played a game called Shadowbane. I was part of a guild who was also part of an alliance of several other guilds that monopolized all of the iron and the highest quality iron on our server. Any other group of players, whether they were smaller guilds or even individual solo players, who wanted to get anything of value or merit from that server, on that server, had to go through our guild alliance. And anybody who was a startup or trying to get ahead, we would immediately step on and squash with our numerical and resource superiority. Now, this is pretty fun for us. This was fun for maybe 2 to 3 to 4 months tops, until the server that we were on died, and then the game shortly after also died. And I learned a very valuable lesson from my very short time in Shadowbane, is that having players control or have direct influence over something without a larger faction involved is usually a bad idea. And I'm still very good friends with one of the consultants / developers for Shadowbane. Maybe one of these days I can get him to come on here and have a podcast with me and we could talk about Star Citizen and factions, but that's a different topic for another video. Now, I'm sure some of you are probably going to try and counter this with EVE Online. I'm going to be very honest, I don't know much about EVE Online. I don't play the game. So if you do know more, please put it in the comments, but that's why I don't typically talk about EVE. I don't want to sound like a poser, and I also don't want to just talk about something I don't know about. Because the secret to always being right is to only talk about things you know about. But given that Shadowbane example, I could see the same thing happening very easily in Star Citizen. And a lot of that is because we have a game that's meant to be an open world sandbox, and people for some reason think that an open world sandbox cannot have factions. Thankfully, SIG seems to disagree because we are getting factions in Pyro. Only 2 of them. And this is good, this is a step in the right direction, and I hope it's a building block and a foundation for more factions, but I would like to see at least 3 and only 3 factions that are joinable for this type of gameplay, especially PvP gameplay. I feel like the 3 faction cap is that sweet spot, because with 3 factions, you allow 2 to gang up on one that gets too powerful. It acts like a check and a balance, and the game often needs that. Now, you don't always need that, but in my experience from Dark Age of Camelot to Planetside 1 and Planetside 2, you always needed those 3 factions to keep one from getting way too powerful. I can very easily see Star Citizen without factions having an issue where a mega corporation of players conglomerates together with another slightly smaller or larger mega corporation and just hoovers up all the resources. And this leaves players unable to really band together and fight that stronger group, and then we get what we had in Shadowbane. And again, I can hear the rebuttal, but EVE Online. Anything that happened in EVE Online with alliances or people getting together to fight a bigger group, you have to understand the different mentality of people on the internet back then, and the different type of gamer, quote-unquote, that people were. I simply don't see that happening now in the modern gaming era. And that is why I so very, very strongly oppose player nations, player alliances, things that are out of bounds from the game rule set, and why I so very strongly support player factions. If you go back and read that comment that I posted at the start of the video, you'll notice that this man says something that's very important, and that most of the players who play this game are solo. That is not going to change. But just because they are a solo player does not mean that they just prefer to be alone all the time. It's that they don't want to do the extra footwork, whether they don't have the time or the energy or the mentality, whatever it may be. They don't want to do the extra footwork to go out there and socialize with strangers on the internet and make friends. Or perhaps they don't feel comfortable, whatever it may be. Factions solve this problem while also benefiting the solo player and the group player. The solo player can band together on a whim with another player who may happen to also be solo because they are part of the same faction. They know that they are part of the same group, and they can work together and then perhaps make a friendship or go their own separate ways. It does not matter, but it gives them a common ground to unite under on a whim that the game provides and helps create that emergent gameplay while also benefiting the solo player. I don't think players in this game, by and large, are going to join mega organizations. I also don't think players, by and large, are going to join small elite organizations. I think they're going to stay with their friend groups and maybe dip their toes in other orgs here and there, but that's about it. If Star Citizen wants to avoid the issues that other games have had and currently have in regards to not having factions, it is absolutely imperative that they nail this and give players an opportunity to join them, and perhaps even encourage them to do so, at least in Pyro. I can point to you right now games recently that have died off and failed because the games did not have factions, or even games that are coming out that are going to suffer because they do not have factions. The first game that's coming out and has been out in Korea that I also plan to play when it comes out here in North America is Throne and Liberty. This is a game that is very guild focused. It's focused on guilds. There are no factions. And what they have realized during its multiple beta tests and during its release is that the game breaks without factions. They tried to go down the sandbox route of player-made alliances, player-made factions, and all that's happened are players either mass recruit and make a mega guild, and then they circumvent the individual guild cap by making, say, Enclave 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then forming an alliance of those in-house guilds, and they monopolize everything on the server. So then other guilds join that alliance because they want to be part of the winning team, and then it snowballs out of control. There is no check and balance here. So if you want to show up to an event and you want to do something in that game, you have to hope that that mega alliance of players is not there, or that you're in their guild or their alliance. That's it. That's the only chance you have to play the game. Otherwise, you're toast. So the company making that game has realized this and has very rapidly begun to implement some stopgap measures, some band-aids. They've put in quote-unquote factions for certain events. Now, they've done all this very haphazardly, but it shows that the company making Throne and Liberty has an understanding of, oops, we messed up. We really need factions because this is happening. But they're on a schedule, and it's probably too late for them to fully address it. I could be wrong, but they're attempting to. So that's the most recent one, where a game didn't have factions. Developers realized, hey, we need these, and they're trying to very quickly put these back in the game. Another game that does not have factions that's coming out, it's going to suffer the very same fate that every other game has suffered that did not have factions, is of course Ashes of Creation. Now, many moons ago, I wrote this very big design doc for Ashes of Creation pertaining to factions. Maybe one day I'll share it here, but the gist of it is a lot of what I said here, is that without factions, players will want to conglomerate to a larger power structure. Maybe it's a group of mega guilds, or maybe it's just the quote-unquote winning team, and they're going to snowball out of control. And players are not going to band together and fight them. They're going to go play another game. Well, unlucky for Ashes of Creation, or even Throne and Liberty, the MMORPG sphere is still dominated by crappy World of Warcraft. So people will just go back and play that. Or maybe they'll go back and play Final Fantasy XIV. The point is that they have options. So instead of banding together and fighting the larger group, they're just going to go do something else. And that's what I foresee happening to Ashes of Creation, because again, it's a game without factions. Now, a game that did factions, but did them incorrectly, that was also recent, was New World. I played New World. Our guild dominated our New World server. We made a conglomeration of multiple Enclave variants, we turned it into an alliance, and we steamrolled the server. That game had 3 factions, but the reason why that game's 3 factions did not stop us from snowballing was because it did not allow the other 2 factions to actually band together and fight us. Because everything in that game was determined by a 50 versus 50 battleground, an internal battle. So 50 versus 50. It does not matter if faction 1 and 2 outnumbered us. They could only bring in 50 people tops, which meant the game, while having 3 factions, did not implement them correctly. Therefore, the game actually had the same problems that a factionless game would have had. And that's why I'm mentioning this one, is to understand that just because you have factions doesn't mean you're going to have all these problems magically go away. You have to implement it correctly. And so far, to this date, the only 2 games that have had a 3-faction system that did it correctly was Dark Age of Camelot and Planetside 1. Not Planetside 2, Planetside 1. These 2 games, which are much older now, allowed players to join one of 3 factions, and when one got more powerful than the other, they'd gang up on them and beat them into the ground. I guess also an honorable mention could be made for the original version of Guild Wars 2. I did not play that game, so I cannot comment. I did not play the original version. I played much later. But I guess that also had a similar 3-faction system with things that acted like Dark Age relics. So if you know, correct me in the comments here, I'd like to know. But either way, the point still stands that these games, which were open world, large scale PvP, all had 3 factions, and to some degree, those 3 factions were a benefit to the game. The point here of this entire video is that if Star Citizen wants to avoid the failings of recent and past games that were factionless, the simple solution is to put the factions in the game. And I could do a video on factions. This is just a brief touching on the topic. I could do a video on factions that would probably be much longer. And if you want that, also let me know in the comments, because it would require a script and a lot of writing. But the basics here are that Star Citizen is in the right direction with these factions, and I want to see how they're implemented. Because I think without some form of faction system in Star Citizen, it's going to suffer the same fate and have the same issues that all other factionless games prior to it have had. So, thank you for listening. Again, our Discord's open. Hop on our Discord if you guys want to chat. We're pretty active over here. And hit me up in the comments.